Do you want a build that absolutely melts everything in its path, including Wave 20 Simulacrums, high-tier Delirium maps, and more? How about being able to press a single button and run with the wind in your hair while you set the world around you ablaze? Look no further than this full guide to my Ignite Vaal Fireball Chieftain that I've dubbed the Burning Beeftain. Hey guys, Big Ducks here, welcome back to the channel, and before we begin, there's a few things that we need to do. You need to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with the latest videos, and if you want to help me out, make sure to like the video as well to get it in front of more people. And if you can do that for me, then I'll teach you how to set the world ablaze. But before we begin, let me give you just a taste of what's to come. Welcome to my full guide on the Vaal Fireball Ignite Chieftain that I've dubbed the Burning Beeftain. So let's go over some of the pros and cons about this build. Starting with the pros, it has absolutely monstrous clear. This is probably the most powerful build that I've had for clear, I think that I've ever played at this budget level. Now, the single target is respectable, and I was able to kill Uber Elder, Wave 20 Simulacrum bosses, A8 Cirrus, and a ton of other things, but it's not going to, completely destroy bosses. It'll take a little bit of time. The build is relatively cheap, and most of the gear is extremely cheap. There are a few things that will be a little bit more expensive, and we'll talk about those later. The build is insanely tanky. It's got between 6,000 to 7,000 health, 30,000 to 40,000 armor while clearing, multiple thousands of regen every few seconds, and multiple layers of defense. This is by far one of the tankiest builds that I've played this league. Now this is probably the most fun I've had playing a build in quite some time as well. Honestly, I was kind of sad to have to move on from it, but all things must eventually come to an end. Now a few of the cons. The main weapon of this build is a crafted staff, and honestly, there just aren't very many of them out there. You can substitute with one-handers, but the staff is going to be your best bet, and you're more than likely going to have to craft it. I'll give you some advice on that later in the video. Now this may be a pro for some people, but this build does extensively use cluster jewels to gain the vast majority of its damage, and in that regard, you'll be balancing points around constantly as you level up. If you don't like the idea of having to min-max your build quite frequently, this probably isn't a good thing for you. The build is also starving for skill points. It's not really going to be fully complete until you're close to level 90. I'll give you some advice on how to quickly get to 90 in just a few hours though, with some investment. The last thing is that the build is a little slow moving. We are a mountain of beef, however, and mountains, they don't move too quickly. Now our main ability in this build is Vaal Fireball, or normal Fireball. You use both. The links for that are Combustion, Deadly Ailments, Burning Damage, and Swift Affliction. The next link, you can choose between a few different things. You can either use GMP if you'd like to have that for clear, or you can choose Empower. Now the idea behind not using GMP is that you can sustain just off of the +2 projectiles that you'll get from the Dying Sun Flask that we use. This is also easier if you get Pierce Boots or you anoint for Pierce. We'll talk more about that later as well. Now keep in mind that with the chest piece that we use, you'll need to get a separate version depending on which style you decide to go. Another ability that we use is Incinerate. This is linked with Cast While Channeling, Infused Channeling, Wave of Conviction, Flammability, and Purifying Flame. Now the main reason that we use Incinerate is so that we can get the duration and fire tags for our infused channeling. We use cast while channeling to cast Wave of Conviction. This allows us to get the exposure debuff through fire onto bosses and hard enemies, flammability for our curse, and Purifying Flame leaves consecrated ground, which will give us an insane amount of regeneration, and you can put it pretty much wherever you like. For defensive gems, we use a single cast when damage taken. This is linked with a max stone golem, a Purifying Flame for more consecrated ground, and a Wave of Conviction, just to help us get a few more of those out. For our movement gem, we use Flame Dash, linked with Second Wind. For auras, we use Malevolence. We also use Vaal Molten Shell and Standard Molten Shell. I suggest that you put Standard Molten Shell on your left click so that you can keep the uptime high. These two spells are linked with Empower, as well as increased duration. Other than that, we also use Vaal Righteous Fire. This is mainly for increasing our damage on hard to kill enemies or bosses. This build does have a Path of Building link that you can find down in the description below this video. Path of Building is a free offline character building tool designed by a member of the GGG team that allows you to fully test and customize your character. You can find links to Path of Building, instructions on updating to the community fork, as well as that import link that I was talking about in the description below this video. Now, our tree consists of obtaining as much defenses and life as possible while navigating towards 3 sets of cluster jewels, which this build will make extensive use of. We obtain Elemental Overload, which gives us a significant boost in damage. Blood Magic allows us to spend our generous life pool to cast our spells, and Mortal Conviction behind it provides us a single free aura that will start as Anger and transition into Malevolence. We also obtain the Unwavering Stance Keystone, allowing us to be immune to stun without much downside, as we don't evade much in this build. We tank it all like a champ. As for leveling, we begin as the Marauder, pathing out to the left through life, and our only goal at this stage of the game is to snake our way up to the top of the tree to obtain the Elemental Overload Keystone, while grabbing some life and a small amount of burning damage. As we continue, we grab Blood Magic if you feel comfortable and are tired of being out of mana, as well as Unwavering Stance, and we begin filling in cluster jewels in life. I suggest you use mediums first and upgrade to larges as you obtain more levels. From here on out, it's just slotting in more jewels and filling in more life. And nothing really changes in the endgame. Finish filling out the jewels and finish filling in more life. It's pretty simple, honestly. Our ascendancy is the Chieftain, a fire-centric ascendancy that provides us massive damage multipliers and defenses. Our first point will be Ramako, Sun's Light. This provides us a much needed damage boost early in the game and begins to allow us to focus on burning damage as we level. Next up is Hinekora, Death's Fury. This point provides us sustain through leech as well as a significant buff to bossing damage. The next point is Taoa, Forest Strength. This provides us a source of endurance charge generation and a small increase in damage. And last but not least is Tesalio, Cleansing Water. This provides us a huge bonus to fire resistance, which will assist us in stacking our armor through the Formless Inferno unique. More about that in the item section. It also provides us physical damage taken as fire and some life regeneration. As for bandits, this build is absolutely starved for points, so as per usual with my builds, the only choice here is to kill them all. For our Pantheon, we choose the Soul of Solaris. This Eater of Souls buff is significant for Simulacrums as well if you intend to farm them with this build. I suggest grabbing this upgrade. For minor gods, we use the Soul of Shakiri to help us out with some chaos damage taken. As for playing the build, it's really simple for the most part. You just run around, cast Fireball, and you watch pretty much everything melt. There really isn't much else to the basic gameplay loop. As I said earlier, I suggest assigning Molten Shell to your left click as this will give you a consistent uptime on the buff. We also do make use of our cast while channeling ability to help deal with powerful monsters. Channel for a moment to give yourself the infusion buff, as well as curse and apply exposure onto difficult enemies and bosses. You can start the game with Vaal Fireball and end the game with Vaal Fireball. If the build feels slow early, unfortunately there isn't a lot that can be done about it without playing just a different build basically. You can level with Poet's Pen or something similar, but the vast majority of our damage comes from our cluster jewels, which aren't available until a little bit later into the game. I suggest that you invest in a +2 AoE or projectile corrupted tabula and some Ash Collar wands. That should carry you for a long time. Once you obtain your first ascendancy or two, the build will start to feel absolutely ridiculous, and from about 40 or 50 onwards, it becomes a breeze. As for leveling later on, I said I would give you some advice. The build once geared can handle just about anything, so my suggested leveling plan is to use Breach Stones until the low 80s, and then transition into running Simulacrums or Chayula Breach Stones until you're satisfied with the level you've reached. The non-Chayula basic Breach Stones are quite cheap, and they should be able to get you into the low 80s with no problem. Once you reach endgame maps, you can make extensive use of Vaal Righteous Fire, Vaal Molten Shell, and your Incinerate cast while channeling to handle difficult monsters, and clear with Vaal Fireball while you run effortlessly through the map. Bossing is very similar. Apply your curse and fire exposure through your cast while channeling, and ignite the boss occasionally with your balls of fire. Moving on to our gear. our weapon is a crafted staff. Now to be honest with you, this staff is relatively hard to buy, so you may have to end up crafting something for yourself. What you do is grab an eye level 84 plus hunter influenced eclipse staff and craft with single scorched fossils. The main modifier you're looking for is +3 to levels of all fire spell skill gems. The list of modifiers beyond this that you're looking for are ignites you inflict deal damage faster. After that is fire damage over time multiplier. Everything else is secondary, but in order of importance is fire damage, fire resistance, and then fire damage to spells. Keep in mind that you can craft fire damage over time multiplier if it doesn't roll on the item. For body armor, early on you can use a comb's chest piece. It's solid, it has a ton of life, and it's got fire damage. Not much more we could ask for. However, as soon as you're ready to upgrade, the thing that I would suggest that you do is you grab a corrupted skin of the loyal with +2 to level of socketed projectile gems. In general, this corruption is going to be much cheaper than the +2 to AoE gems, and you should be able to find one as long as you keep an eye out. And if you're seriously rich and want to make a mistake, you can look for both of them, a double corrupted skin of the loyal with +2 of socketed projectile gems and +2 to AoE gems. Expect to spend 30 to 50 exalt. Now make sure that you get the correct colors, as you cannot change them. Due to fireball scaling ignite damage heavily with levels, we can abuse empower and gem levels to obtain a very high level fireball. Now our helmet is the Formless Inferno. This helmet allows us to turn overcapped fire resistance into massive amounts of armor scaling. The Chieftain Ascendancy allows us to easily scale this through the roof into an insane amount of armor, which helps us scale our Molten Shell, which is one of the main layers of defense of this build. As for enchants, there honestly isn't really much that's useful. Any damage or defensive enchants that help us are solid, nothing particularly stands out. For boots, we're looking for a rare with stats, life, resists, and high movement speed. This build is starved for intelligence and dexterity, so make sure to look for some of those if you can get them. For enchants, fire damage, regeneration, increased movement speed, and damage penetration are all solid options. For gloves, we're looking for Shaper influenced gloves with fire damage over time multiplier, life, resists, and as much armor as we can get. For a belt, I personally went with an Elder belt with as much life and life percentage increase as I could get, as well as resists. For our amulet, we're looking for as much dexterity and intelligence as we can get on a Warlord influenced amulet. This allows us to get +1 to level of all fire skill gems, and beyond that, we're looking for life and resists. The +1 amulet is not required, but it is a worthwhile investment. I ended up crafting it with my leftover scorched fossils from crafting my staff. As for anointments, you can either go for growth and decay for damage and regeneration, or if you're looking for a bit better clear, you can anoint piercing shots, which will give us pierce. Our rings will be a major source of resistance for us. You'll need to get most of the resist of the build in your rings, besides fire resist of course. I also suggest that you get as much life as you can. You can also get stats here if you need extra. Now as for flasks, let's start with the unique ones that we use. The Dying Sun flask, which gives us additional projectiles and area of effect and also gives us a ton of fire resistance, is probably the #1 buy that you should get when it comes to flasks. It helps scale our helmet, and it also makes us take less fire damage, which synergizes well with the fire damage taken as physical mods that we get from that helmet and our ascendancy. We also use the Cinder Swallow urn. Now this flask is a little bit expensive, but it is absolutely worth investing in getting at least one. You can use whatever version you like here, but the flask is perfect for this build. It provides us damage to ignited enemies and a crazy amount of recovery of life on kill. As for normal flask, we use a basalt flask, a granite flask, and for the last flask you can switch between a few different ones. If you want speed, you can use a quicksilver with adrenaline. If you're doing the simulacrum, you can use an amethyst flask with shock immunity, or you can use a sulfur flask with adrenaline. In the end, the sulfur flask with adrenaline is what I decided to stick with. Another alternative here is a wise oak flask, but I prefer the other options to it, as our damage and elemental defenses are good enough at this point. Make sure that you grab curse and chill/freeze immunity from your flasks as well. Bleed immunity is okay, but it's mainly going to be corrupted blood that's the issue for this build, which we'll solve with a jewel. Now speaking of jewels, they are a major point of this build, and the majority of our damage comes from the cluster variety. Now starting with large cluster jewels, we use up to 3 of them, but most people who aren't gunning for 100 will land at around 2. We want 8 passive, fire damage, large cluster jewels with 2 jewel sockets and the burning bright node. These are the only absolute requirements, but ultimately you want 2 additional nodes as well. Keep in mind that the best combination is going to be insanely expensive compared to 1 node being off. It probably isn't worth getting the absolute best. The nodes in order of importance are Prismatic Heart, Widespread Destruction, a one-off of Cremator to help with porcupines, Disorienting Display, and then everything else. Now as for medium jewels, we use up to 6 of them. We want 4 or 5 passive fire damage over time multiplier medium cluster jewels with 1 socket and the Cooked Alive node. Beyond that, you want a single Fan the Flame node to assist with Ignite Spread and then Wasting Affliction or Blowback for all of the rest. These nodes contribute a massive amount of damage to our build. Don't skimp here. For the small jewel sockets, I suggest 3 passive life small cluster jewels with stats and resists, as well as the surging vitality or fetal nodes. If you need more chaos resist, you can opt for a chaos resist small cluster jewel with the student of decay node. I went with one of those. Now as for standard jewels, we use 2 of them. One is the rolling flames jewel inserted in the jewel socket above the devotion life node. Get a corrupted blood immunity implicit on this jewel as it's quite cheap. This provides us some insane clear by allowing us to shoot our fireballs down hallways or from range and have it hit almost the entire screen. The only other jewel is a Watcher's Eye with the increased recovery rate of life while affected by malevolence. This modifier should not be too expensive by itself. We slot it in the jewel socket above the Juggernaut node. This build shaped up to be my absolute favorite build of the Delirium League. It's able to do all of the content comfortably, it has an easy but satisfying playstyle, the gear isn't too insanely expensive, but if you want you can scale it really far up if you're so inclined. It's tanky, has good recovery, great defenses, and probably some of the best clear on this budget while still being tanky that exists in the game while not sacrificing too much single target performance. I highly suggest if you're looking for something in that realm, give this build a try. So if you do try this build, make sure to let me know in the comments. I try to read every one that I can. I don't respond to all of them because honestly there's just not enough time in the day to respond to all the comments that you guys have been giving me. Also, don't forget that if this video helped you out, like the video so more people can see it, and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel for more content similar to this. Stay safe out there in Ray class, and I'll see you guys in the next video.